Well, welcome everyone to our community Bible study for Thursday, December the 10th, the year 2020. We've been studying profiles of faith of various individuals from ancient Israel, and we will continue to proceed. But I thought that since to this evening will be the first evening of Hanukkah, that we might look at profiling the faith of the Maccabees, especially Judas Maccabee, which is a great story of how a few individuals were able to overcome, and the miracle of relighting the menorah in the temple. The books of 1st and 2nd Maccabee are included in writings that sometimes are called intertestamental in our Christian community, because they take place from about 300 BC to about 100 AD, which is the gap in between what we call the Old and the New Testaments. These books are included in the Bibles of the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches, but during the Reformation, many Protestant churches didn't see them as having quite the same authority, and so they are considered apocryphal. And, I have a New Revised Standard Study Bible that has the Old and New Testament and the Apocrypha. And so the Maccabees are found in that Apocrypha. About the Maccabees themselves, throughout history, the ancient lands of Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms in the past, have been claimed by many nations. There was, Egypt and the various empires that were based there in the south of them, and then Syria and Iraq and Iran and the empires all the way to Persia in the north, and they were sort of in the middle. And at this point in time, in history, Judah Maccabee and his brothers led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire, which at that time was based, I believe, in Syria, but stretched from Turkey all the way through Iraq and Iran to the edges of what we would call India today. So it was a pretty impressive feat for this small group of fighters to take on the immense armies of their oppressors. And if you have the study guide, you can see how small Israel is in compared to the entire empire that was ruling them at the time. The story ends up centering around the menorah in the temple. So as a little background, the study guide, I also have a photo that is a replica of the menorah. It was made of pure gold. It was used by Moses in the wilderness, and then later in the temple in Jerusalem. It required fresh olive oil to be burnt every day to light the 7 lamps of the menorah. And that has been, the menorah has been a symbol of Israel since ancient times, and on today's Israeli coat of arms, you'll see it featured prominently. There's 2 books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They both tell the stories of the struggle that they had trying to overthrow the Seleucid Empire. But the 1st Maccabees includes a story about the purification of the temple, how they freed the city, how they rededicated the temple, and then the miracle of the lighting of the menorah. So we'll read a little bit in 1st Maccabees chapter 4. The battle was at Emmaus at this point, which is not too far outside of Jerusalem. Gorgias, who was the general of the rival troops, took 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry and moved out by night to fall upon the camp of the Jews and attack them. Men from the citadel were his guides. But Judas Maccabee, heard of it, and he and his warriors moved out to attack the king's force in Emmaus while the division was still out of the camp. So he kind of did an end around. When Gorgias entered the camp of Judas by night, he found no one was there. So he looked for them in the hills because he said, these men are running away from us. Well, in actuality, they were attacking them from another area. At daybreak, Judas appeared in the plain with 3,000 men, But they didn't have armor and swords as they had desired. And they saw the camp of the Gentiles, strong and fortified, with cavalry all around it and men who were trained well in war. But Judas said to those who were with him, "Do not fear their numbers, or be afraid when they charge. Remember how our ancestors were saved at the Red Sea, when Pharaoh with his forces pursued them. And so let us cry to heaven and see whether God will favor us and remember his covenant with our ancestors and crush this army." The foreigners saw the Maccabees coming towards them, and they went out to battle with them. And the men with the Judas Maccabee blew their trumpets and engaged in battle, and the forces were defeated and fled. The Maccabees pursued them all the way to Guzara, the plains of Idumea. Boy, some of these names are tough. And to Azotus, and 3,000 soldiers fell. So Judas finished that army off very well. It wasn't the end of all of this, but it was this battle anyway. Even you can look on the map and identify even some of these names from today. So after he finished that battle and the next, Judas and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion, which is the mount where the temple was in Jerusalem. They saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of their mountains. They also saw the chambers of the priests were in ruins. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. It must have been a horrible sight for them to find that the temple area was destroyed and treated as badly as it was. Verse 41, then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. I guess there were still some in there. He chose blameless priests who had been devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. The priests knew how to follow the law of Torah and Leviticus and follow the instructions on what it was required for the temple area to be clean and purified. Verse 44, they deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering which had been profaned. And they thought it best to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell them what to do with them. They just didn't know, but they knew that this was this needed to come down and they would have to do something later. Then they took unhewn stones, as the law directs, that had never been cut, and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and these gave light to the temple. They placed bread on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. It was an attempt to restore the temple to its glory. There was very great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Early in the morning, on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Chislev, in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At the very season, and on that very day the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. It was a celebration. All the people fell on their faces and worshiped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days. Those are the 8 days we read today. And joyfully burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They dedicated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priests and fitted them with the doors. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of the dedication of the altar would be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days. At that time, they fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers to keep the Gentiles from coming and trampling them down as they had done before. And Judas Maccabees stationed a garrison to guard it, so that the people would have a stronghold. They did face other battles, and the story wasn't over. But the only oil they could find that was already purified was about what you normally have for one day. And somehow the miracle was that it lasted for 8 days, the 8 days they mention here. And that gave them time to purify other oil in order for them to then continue the lighting of the lamp of the menorah. That lamp was supposed to burn every day, and as a sign of the presence of God in the temple. It's interesting that today in some Christian churches, including the church that I attend, St. John Lutheran in Winter Park, where there is an eternal flame. We have a lamp similar, well, it's not similar, but in the same idea of that burns always. It is, the one that we have burns, I believe, with oil, and it lasts a certain amount of time and it's replaced, but is a reminder that God's presence is always here with us. That Judas Maccabee and his brothers, his father, Matthias, I think that's how you pronounce his name, it's spelled a little differently, began some of this revolt and was killed, and his 4 sons, Judas and the others, took up the revolt, and Judas was the one who led through the great battles. And he was killed at one point, and some others continued. But this was a story of dedication, a story of hope, a story that they were not willing to bow down to the Greek, Seleucid, foreign religion, and that they insisted on the sanctity of the temple, the sanctity of their faith. And so it is a story that light can overcome darkness. There can be hope even when there's a midst of dark days. And so I hope that as we observe our Jewish friends and neighbors who celebrate the first night of Hanukkah tonight, the first of those 8 days, that we will remember that it's part of our history too. And we will celebrate the light in the darkness, the right over the wrong, the hope in the midst of times of difficulty. And so that's the story of the Maccabees. And I hope that you will join us again next week. Have a good day and God bless you.